What we're going to be talking about today is 6 different concepts about Terraform that are going to help you to learn and understand what Terraform is and how it works. Explicitly, this isn't a video about, it's not a tutorial about Terraform, because I feel that the best way for you to understand Terraform is to first understand these 6 concepts and then have a go in practice. Once you understand how broad the topic area is, it's going to make it easier to work with Terraform when you understand these main concepts. So, what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk about what Terraform is. We're going to talk about why you should learn Terraform. And then we're going to talk about 6 different concepts within Terraform that you should know about. 6 different main concepts. So first up, what is Terraform? Terraform is an infrastructure as code tool. What that means is it allows you to provision, create, modify, destroy infrastructure using code. So you specify what you want in code, and then Terraform is going to help you run that code in order to create the infrastructure based on your code. There's a bunch of different reasons that you'd want to do this. We won't go into those in this video, but maybe I'll do one in future. If that's something you want to hear about, let me know. And basically, Terraform is a command line utility. This is an important thing to note. There are other different infrastructure as code tools out there that are not ran as command lines. For instance, AWS CloudFormation is a different example. And AWS CloudFormation runs within AWS, so it's not a command line utility as such. Actually, you send off your code via an API request into AWS itself, and they execute your code. Whereas with Terraform, it actually executes on either your machine or a build server, or basically a server that you own. But there's a little bit of a nuance here that we want to think about when we're working with Terraform, and we'll get into that just in a little bit. And then the last thing to consider is that Terraform is a declarative tool. So there are different infrastructure as code tools out there that are not declarative. They work in a slightly different way, and we'll talk about what this means, the pros and the cons, in just a little bit. So, why should you learn Terraform? Why should you learn Terraform in the first place? So there are a lot of enterprise reasons why you'd want to learn infrastructure as code, for instance. However, today we're talking about Terraform specifically, and I want to talk about why you should learn Terraform, not why your company should adopt Terraform. I think one of the big and the main reasons for me is it helps you to learn cloud skills. It's going to reduce the frustration that you feel when you're actually creating different things within the cloud. So let's say if you wanted to work with Lambda in AWS, there's a lot of different bits and pieces you're going to have to configure. So either you can go in there and do that manually if you want, but I feel like what's going to happen is something's going to break, you're going to go in, you're going to touch something else is going to break, and then you're going to quickly lose track. However, when you use Terraform with your experimenting, what you're doing is you're creating that infrastructure within code, and then that's going to make your learning experience on top of these cloud providers when playing about with different cloud tools that little bit easier. For instance, the other day I was creating some different networking things on top of AWS, and I wrote a lot of different script in Terraform, and what that meant is when I was done, I could easily tear down that stack, and then I wasn't getting charged for the additional resources. And one of the other things to consider there is because it's in code, you can do everything incrementally. So you can write a server, and then when it stops working, you can save it, you can commit it. You can write your database, you can save, you can commit. And that sort of incremental process is going to reduce the frustration that you feel when operating in the cloud. So if you're the kind of person that's been poking around in different cloud providers manually, and you've been sort of having a bit of headache, then Terraform is probably one of the solutions that you want to look into, because that's going to reduce that frustration. Secondly, is infrastructure skills are going to make you a better software engineer as a whole. So when you use Terraform, it allows you to provision cloud resources, and then once you start getting a little bit better at provisioning different cloud resources, you're going to start thinking about the implications of what it means to create these different resources. Like we said before about building Lambda. Rather than just creating the application code, you're going to be creating the infrastructure behind AWS Lambda, and you're going to be thinking about what the considerations that you need to take into account when building on top of Lambda. That could be testing, release process, that could be monitoring, observability, logging. All of these different things you'll want to consider, and when you're working with Terraform, that's going to help you to create those cloud resources, and it's going to make you think in a bit more of a broader sense of the things that you're doing. And last up, before we do get onto the concepts, is Terraform is like a great first tool. If you're interested in cloud technology, then when you learn Terraform, as we said, it makes everything about learning cloud a little bit easier, and I think it's a great first tool. I think it's very simple and very easy to get to use, and that's why we're doing this introduction today, because I think it's something that's really going to help you out. Right, so what are the main concepts that we're talking about today? So we're going to talk about providers, which is the way that Terraform works with different platforms. We'll talk about state, which is how Terraform knows which infrastructure you're making your infrastructure as code against. We'll talk about planning and applying, which is how you know what is going to be ran on your infrastructure and then how you actually execute that. We'll talk about HCL, which is Terraform's language, how that language looks and what you'll need to know about the language. We'll talk about dependency resolution, which is basically how Terraform works out which resources to create before which resources. And then we'll talk about the file structure. So after we've gone through all these concepts, you'll probably be itching to have a go, and you'll probably want to know how that file structure works. So I'll talk a little bit about how that file structure does work, and that will just get you going with Terraform so that after the video you can have a go. So providers, we've basically got an example here of a Terraform provider. Terraform itself is just the tool that allows you to run infrastructure as code, whereas the notion of a provider is like a third-party plugin that helps you to work with a different third party. Different third party could be AWS, could be GCP. It can even be something like Auth0, which is an authentication service. And that's all enabled for you by what is a provider. And a provider is a connection between Terraform and that third party. So someone out there in open source has created this provider, and what that does under the hood is it's just going to call those different APIs for that provider to either create the resources, delete them, etc. So let's say if you want to use Terraform with AWS. Here you've got an example of how you configure that provider with AWS, and you provide an option. So in this example, for instance, we've got a region here which is EU Central 1, and that basically is going to set up this provider so that it works with EU Central. Each different provider is going to have different configuration options, and I think one of the biggest things that you might run into when you're using Terraform is that you don't have a problem with learning Terraform as much as you have a problem learning that provider. So whichever infrastructure you're trying to provision, what I'd suggest is learning about the infrastructure and also learning about Terraform separately. And then you can bring the two together so that you're not confusing cloud concepts with Terraform itself. But yeah, we'll just be talking about Terraform today. So once you've configured your provider within Terraform, another command to know is Terraform init. What that's basically going to do is install all of that code that's needed for you to run that given provider. So let's say you're working with AWS, you would go in, you add your configuration for your AWS provider, and you run Terraform init. That's going to pull down that provider's code, and then that's going to allow you to provision AWS resources. As we said, it's a CLI, it works on your machine, so Terraform needs that code to understand how to create those different cloud resources. Next up is Terraform state. This is a big topic within Terraform. So I mentioned before that Terraform is a command line utility, and in order for Terraform to work as a command line utility, it has this idea of state. State is basically what Terraform thinks your remote infrastructure looks like. So it is the Terraform representation of your infrastructure. Why do we need this? Let's say, for instance, that you have a cloud account and it has two servers within it. Let's say one of them is an experimental server and one of them is a production server. I'm not necessarily recommending that you set up your cloud accounts like this, but let's take the example. Now, your experimental server, you might want to be able to configure manually. You might want to play around with that server. However, you might want the other server to be managed from Terraform. And that means that you need to have you want to distinguish between the server that you don't want to manage the one that you do. And the way that you do that is through Terraform state. Now I've put this example up here because this is what Terraform state actually looks like. And Terraform state is basically just a JSON file. So in this example, we can see we've got an AWS S3 bucket that's created within Terraform state. And that's like just the example I'm giving you here, which is this is the resource that we want to manage within Terraform. And the main thing to know about Terraform state is when you run different commands, it's going to create that state for you. And it can either create that state locally on your machine, or it can create that state remotely on a different, what they call a Terraform backend. Now, the difference between a local state and a remote state is basically just where this JSON lives. Initially, when I was learning Terraform myself, I got very confused about the notion of a backend. It seemed very complicated. People were saying there's a lot of difficulties with local state, and you read all these things about backends. When you've configured a backend, it's essentially just pushing this JSON file up onto a server. It's not that complicated, and it's actually quite easy to set up. So once you get going with Terraform, I'd recommend having a look at Terraform backends, and that's how you're going to move that remote state or move that state to a remote location. And that just makes working with a team a little bit easier. You can probably imagine that when you're working with state, that when you're working as a team, that if Terraform is modifying this state file and it lives on your machine, that someone else in your team can't also work on that state file at the same time. You've got other complications, such as if you push Terraform state into code into GitHub, for instance, then it's going to have things like secrets in there, and it gets all a little bit messy. And okay, so there's a few problems with local Terraform state. Next up is Terraform Plan, and also we'll get onto Terraform Apply. Terraform Plan is the way that Terraform will basically let you do a dry run to work out how you're going to create those resources on your cloud provider. So we've got an example up here of, again, this is an AWS S3 bucket, and this is basically Terraform. When you run Terraform Plan, Terraform will tell you what's going to happen if you actually execute that plan. So in this case, we're just going to create the bucket. So this is pretty straightforward. However, there's a couple of different things that can happen from a Terraform plan. Terraform could tell you that it's going to tear down an infrastructure. It could tell you that it's going to tear down and replace infrastructure, or it could tell you that it's going to modify it in place. Now, of course, there are different nuances to these different types of amendments. Sometimes you might be okay to delete that resource. Sometimes you might want to keep it in place. And then that's how Terraform is going to help you keep sort of a high availability infrastructure, because you're able to manage your infrastructure and know whether a resource is going to be deleted and put back online. If you've got a server, for instance, that can't be destroyed and recreated, then when you're running Terraform Plan, it allows you to do that dry run to make sure that you're not going to make any changes that are going to cause damage that you might not want to actually do within your cloud provider. And then the next thing is Terraform Apply. Now, Terraform Apply is very linked to Terraform Plan. Basically, a Terraform Apply is the same as a plan. It will tell you the execution plan. Again, we've got an S3 bucket being created. The only difference with an apply is it's going to ask at the end whether you actually want to perform these actions, and then it's going to go ahead and actually do them. The only thing to consider about apply, though, is that even though you've got an execution plan, when you come to applying that Terraform, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be successful. So what I mean by that is when Terraform runs the apply, let's take the bucket example, Terraform will be like, okay, that's fine. We can create a bucket. That's okay. You know, that's going to be a new bucket. We're not managing that in state, so we're going to go ahead and create a new bucket for you. The problem is that there are different rules in those different providers. For instance, with a bucket, it has a global namespace, which means the name of an AWS S3 bucket has to be the same, has to be globally unique, which means that if you've named your bucket after a name that's already taken, when you run your Terraform apply, AWS might throw back an error saying, I'm sorry, you can't have that bucket name, it already exists. And the problem is that Terraform apply is not going to show you that. So when you're creating these execution plans, you're basically, as you create them, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be created successfully, because it's going to execute those cloud provider commands under the hood, and those might fail for various reasons related to the cloud provider themselves. It's just a little nuance to consider. Just because when you've planned something that it shows you that it's correct, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to execute correctly, and it's a bit of a gotcha when you're working with Terraform. So we're kind of just over halfway through now, and we're going to have a quick look at what Terraform actually looks like. So here you go. This is basically a full working example of Terraform code. If you were to take this code, paste it, and then run Terraform Plan, it would then hook into your AWS provider, and it would then go ahead and try to create this new AWS S3 bucket. Now, we've called it your new bucket. That probably exists. Somebody probably has already created that, so AWS would throw you an error. However, so if you change that, then that would be able to then actually provision that resource for you and create you a bucket. And this is basically all that you need in order to work with Terraform. You need to have a Terraform block, and then you have the version. That's the option for that Terraform piece. You have a provider. In this case, this is AWS, and the option is EU Central. And then at the bottom, we have a resource, which is the bucket that we're going to create. So they're the different pieces that you need in order to work with Terraform, and that's basically it. When we talk about file structure, you'll realize that actually you can even put all of this code into a single file and run it as it is. You can also break that down into different ways, and there are certain sort of standards and practices to apply when you break down that Terraform code. So what you'll notice here is that each different, and the thing that I want to draw your attention to is that each different of these code blocks looks very similar. So you see you've got this first keyword, we've got Terraform, we've got provider, and we've got resource. And that's your Terraform command. So that's the thing that you're asking Terraform to configure or to do. And then after that, you've got an argument. For the provider, it's AWS. For the resource, it's an AWS S3 bucket. And Let's take the resource example. You can see that S3 bucket. That is an argument that's given to that AWS provider. So because we've got AWS installed now, we can actually create AWS S3 buckets. And notice that you've got the AWS prefix on top of the S3 bucket, and that tells Terraform that you want to create an S3 bucket as part of your AWS provider. And the last thing is, in some commands you have a final argument. In the resource case, we've got your new bucket. The reason that's important when you're creating resources is so that you can reference them in different resources. So let's say you have a server and you have a database. You obviously want to create, or you might want to create the database first, and then you would want to pass those credentials into your server. So what you would want to do is tell Terraform to create me a server and pass the credentials or the outputs of that resource into the next resource, which is my server, so that my server can then access my database. So that's the basics of the Terraform language. It's quite simple. Everything is in these little blocks, and that's the basic syntax. If you get that kind of syntax down, then you'll be up and running with Terraform pretty quickly. And then number 5 is dependency resolution. So as I mentioned just now, I said that if you create a database and then you want to create a server, then Terraform is actually going to do some really cool stuff, which is it will work out a dependency graph for you. It knows which resource to create before the next resource. So when I said before that Terraform was declarative, basically we tell it what we want our target state to be. So on the previous slide, we said our target state, or you want an S3 bucket. If that bucket already exists and we run a Terraform plan, Terraform's going to say, okay, no change. I don't need to do anything different. And the reason it does that is because of this idea of dependency resolution. If we have a database and we have a server that one is created and then the next one is created, then Terraform's going to work out which one needs to be created before the next. Terraform's very clever like this. It's just something not to think about, but to know about Terraform is that it will work out what order it needs to create your resources in, and that's just going to make life a little bit easier for you when you're writing your infrastructure as code. You don't necessarily need to explicitly say this resource comes before another resource. There are some subtle nuances to that where sometimes you might need to specify the dependency ordering, but for the most part, Terraform will work that out for you, which is a really cool feature. And finally, we come on to the file structure. So we've talked about providers, which are how you configure these third-party connections. We've talked about the language. We've talked about the code structure. We've talked about Terraform state. We've talked about how you can plan those infrastructure changes on your cloud provider. And then there are all the concepts that you need. So when it comes to actually implementing Terraform, then the final thing that you need to know about is file structure. And this is basically, so if you look here, this is just an example of a basic file structure with Terraform, where you've got this .terraform, you've got a TF state, you've got a main, and you've got 2 different resource files. So generally speaking, all of your Terraform is configured in these files with this .tf extension. And when you run your Terraform command, such as Terraform plan, it's going to look within your current directory for anything that has a .tf. So anything within your current folder, for instance here in your project, Terraform's going to know that that's a Terraform file, and it's going to pull that in, and it's going to do its execution on top of those different Terraform files. And you don't have to do anything. You don't have to include it. You don't have to specify it in any configuration. Terraform's smart enough to look within that directory and then look for those .tf files. So the .terraform is basically metadata. So it's actually a folder. I think it's a folder. Basically, when you do your Terraform inside of that folder, it's going to create all of your plugin options and things like that. So if you do ever get yourself into a pickle with Terraform, what you can actually do is just remove that folder, rerun Terraform in it, and you can start everything again. And then finally, we've got the TF state. So Terraform out of the box, if you don't configure a backend, is going to create your state locally. So it's going to create that JSON file about the resources on your local machine. If we take our example from before about our S3 bucket, when we're creating that S3 bucket, once Terraform is finished running that command, it's going to create you a TF state file. And inside that TF state file is going to be the information about that S3 bucket that you created. Then if you were to run Terraform plan again, like we said before, Terraform's going to say, okay, there are no changes here. The TF state, everything's up to date, no changes to make. And that's all part of the declarative sort of Terraform process. Okay. And that's it. They're all the main concepts about Terraform. I understand that was fairly quick, and we did go over quite a few concepts. But if you go and have an experiment with Terraform, actually try and have a go writing your own code, and then come back and then just watch through the concepts again, then they'll start to make a little bit more sense. You can put them into context, and you'll start to say, okay, Now I understand what he meant about when we were talking about Terraform state being locally or remote, or when we talked about providers. As soon as you have to configure your own provider, you'll be understanding those differences between Terraform just being the mechanism to create that infrastructure, and the provider being the code that's going to allow you to do that on a given third-party resource. So that's it. I hope that helped sort of give you an introduction to Terraform. Have a go. I really don't think it's particularly that difficult. It's quite an easy concept, and it is just, once you get it down, it becomes quite simple, and you'll be very glad that you did. So have a go. Terraform concepts. Let me know what you thought of the video. Any sort of improvements for the future, do let me know, and then I'll incorporate them in future videos. If there's anything you want to see in particular as well, any other future videos that you want, then just let me know.